Let me be direct with you. I spent 32 years in uniform. I fought in Desert Storm. I watched this country win wars, and I watched this country squander victories through political timidity and strategic confusion. What happened tonight is neither a tactical setback nor a diplomatic complication. What happened tonight is a fundamental restructuring of military power in the Middle East. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that means. Not the sanitized version you will hear from the think tanks in Washington, not the reassuring nonsense from the cable networks, but the ground truth that every commander who has ever planned an air operation in this theater needs to understand right now. For 40 years, for decades, American and Israeli military planning in this region has rested on a single foundational assumption. We own the sky, not partially, not conditionally, completely. The condition military professionals call air superiority, the ability to conduct your own air operations without prohibitive interference while denying that same freedom to your adversary, has been the bedrock on which every American and Israeli military operation in this theater has been designed and executed. Every ground offensive, every strike package, every evacuation operation, every resupply mission, all of it, every bit of it, planned on the assumption that American and Israeli aircraft control the airspace above the operational area. That assumption ended tonight at 7:23 p.m. local time. The first elements of a Russian air transfer, 72 hours of continuous cargo and ferry flights, completed their arrival at Shahid Noj Air Base outside Hamadan in western Iran. 300 aircraft, not trainers, not obsolete export variants stripped of their best systems, not the degraded second-tier equipment that Russia has historically offloaded to regional partners when it suits Moscow's purposes. 300 frontline Russian Air Force combat aircraft, Su-35S air superiority fighters, Su-34 strike aircraft, MiG-31BM interceptors, transferred with their complete weapon systems, their electronic warfare pods, their full air-to-air missile loadouts, and the Russian technical and advisory personnel required to integrate them into Iranian air operations infrastructure. The regional air balance that American and Israeli military planners have used as a foundational assumption for 40 years has just been invalidated, not degraded, not challenged, invalidated. And tonight in Tel Aviv, in the underground command facility where the Israeli Air Force's most senior commanders are conducting the most urgent operational assessment in that service's history, a clock is running 24 hours, not because Iran has issued an ultimatum, because Israeli air power doctrine, the doctrine built on air superiority that has been Israel's primary military advantage since 1967, has a specific and finite window within which it can act against a newly arrived air capability before that capability reaches full operational integration. After that window closes, the operational calculus changes permanently. I want to answer 4 questions tonight. 4 questions that the mainstream defense commentary is not asking with the seriousness this moment demands. First, what specifically has Russia transferred, and why does the combination of Su-35S, Su-34, and MiG-31BM represent a qualitative threshold crossing rather than simply a numerical increase in Iranian aircraft? Second, why does Israel have 24 hours? What specific operational logic defines the window between aircraft arrival and full operational integration? And what happens to the Israeli strike option when that window closes? Third, what does the loss of American air superiority over the Persian Gulf and Eastern Mediterranean actually mean for specific missions? Walk through the operations American and Israeli forces have been executing on the assumption of air superiority and explain what each of those operations looks like when that assumption no longer holds. Fourth, what is Washington's response? And what does that response or the absence of it, and tell us about where the practical boundary of American military commitment in this theater actually lies? Stay with me, because the answers describe a permanent alteration in the regional air balance that will shape every military operation in this theater for the next generation. What Russia actually transferred, and why the selection matters. Let me start with the specific aircraft transferred because the selection reveals the operational planning behind this transfer with a clarity that no intelligence assessment could improve upon. Russia did not simply transfer 300 aircraft to Iran. Russia transferred 3 specific aircraft types, each one selected to address a precise gap in Iranian air capability. in a combination whose operational synergy produces an air warfare capability that is qualitatively different from the sum of its individual components. The Su-35S air superiority. The Su-35S is Russia's most capable operational air superiority fighter, a fourth-generation plus aircraft whose combination of aerodynamic performance, sensor capability, and weapons integration represents the apex of non-stealth fighter design. Its relevance to the Iranian operational requirement is specific and direct. Iran's existing Air Force, a combination of aging American F-14s, F-4s, and F-5s acquired before the revolution, supplemented by Russian Su-24s and MiG-29s from the 1990s, is capable of providing a degree of air defense within Iranian airspace against non-stealth opponents. It is not capable of contesting airspace against F-15s, F-16s, and F-35s operating from Israeli and American bases. The Su-35S changes that calculation entirely. Its passive electronically scanned array radar can detect stealth-reduced aircraft at ranges that predecessor systems cannot reach. Its R-77 and R-37M beyond visual range missiles provide engagement capability at distances that force Israeli F-35 pilots to operate with a situational awareness burden that significantly degrades their strike effectiveness. And its sustained supercruise capability, the ability to maintain supersonic flight without afterburner, provides an energy management advantage in within-visual range combat that Iranian pilots have never previously possessed. 120 Su-35S aircraft transferred to Iran has not created an air force that defeats the Israeli Air Force in a sustained campaign. What it has created is an air force that can contest Israeli air superiority, that can impose costs on Israeli air operations that Israeli doctrine has never had to account for, in ways that fundamentally alter the operational calculus for every mission the IAF plans to execute. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a doctrinal earthquake. The Su-34 strike capability. The Su-34 is Russia's primary strike aircraft, a two-seat supersonic platform optimized for precision ground attack at low and medium altitudes, with a combat radius of approximately 100 kilometers. Its relevance to the Iranian operational requirement is equally specific. Iran's existing strike capability, the Shahed drones, the Zulfikar missiles, the ballistic missiles that prior analysis in this series has documented, is primarily missile and drone-based, effective against fixed targets, effective against air defense infrastructure, significantly less effective against mobile targets, dispersed forces, and the kind of dynamic targeting that a ground campaign requires. The Su-34 fills that gap precisely: precision engagement of mobile targets, suppression of enemy air defenses ahead of advancing ground forces, the flexibility of human judgment in a targeting loop that autonomous systems cannot replicate. 100 Su-34s operating from Iranian bases can reach every military target in Israel, every American base in the Gulf region, and every naval asset operating in the Eastern Mediterranean and Northern Arabian Sea. Let that sink in. The MiG-31BM, intercept and area denial. The MiG-31BM is the most specialized of the three transferred types, and the one whose operational significance is most frequently underestimated by analysts focused exclusively on the air superiority and strike dimensions. The MiG-31BM is a dedicated interceptor and area denial platform, an aircraft specifically designed to patrol large volumes of airspace at supersonic speeds and engage targets at extreme ranges using the R-37M missile, an engagement envelope that extends to 300 kilometers. Here is why this matters operationally. American strategic assets. The RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft, the E-8 Joint STARS ground surveillance platforms, the E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control aircraft that provide the tactical picture on which every American air operation depends, currently operate in airspace adjacent to the Iranian threat envelope on the assumption that Iranian intercept capability cannot reach them at their operating altitudes and distances. The MiG-31BM eliminates that assumption with mathematical certainty. 80 MiG-31BMs operating from Iranian bases can place the entire Eastern Mediterranean, the Arabian Sea, and the Persian Gulf within an intercept envelope that American intelligence and command aircraft cannot safely operate within. That is not a tactical problem. That is a strategic blindness problem. Blind American Air Operations, that is the MiG-31BM's specific contribution to tonight's transfer. The 24-hour window, why it exists and what it means. I want to address the 24-hour window directly because it is the operational concept that defines everything else about tonight's situation. The mainstream coverage has characterized it as a deadline. It is not a deadline, it is a specific operational logic derived from the requirements of integrating 300 newly arrived aircraft into a functioning air warfare system. When 300 aircraft arrive at Iranian air bases, they are not immediately operational as a coherent fighting force. The aircraft are mechanically capable, the pilots are trained, the weapons are loaded, the maintenance crews are present. What takes time is integration, and integration is not a bureaucratic formality. It is a military necessity. The Iranian air defense network, the radar systems, the communications infrastructure, the command and control architecture must be updated to recognize 300 new friendly aircraft signatures and incorporate them into the tactical picture without generating the friendly fire incidents that have historically plagued rapid force integration. The Iranian operational planning staffs must develop sortie generation schedules, fuel and weapons allocation plans, and airspace deconfliction procedures that allow 300 additional aircraft to operate alongside Iran's existing air forces without the coordination failures that produce collisions, fratricide, and operational confusion. The Russian advisory personnel must establish communication protocols and operational interfaces that allow Iranian commanders to effectively employ weapon systems whose tactical characteristics differ significantly from the aircraft types they are familiar with. This is not a brief orientation. This is a fundamental retraining of operational habits under time pressure. Intelligence assessments of Russian aircraft transfer operations, based on observed Russian deployments to Syria and on the integration timelines of previous Russian equipment transfers, suggest a minimum integration window of 24 to 48 hours for basic operational capability and 72 to 96 hours for full operational integration. The 24-hour window is the period during which the transferred aircraft are physically present on Iranian soil, but not yet fully integrated into Iranian air operations. During that window, Israeli strike options exist that will not exist after integration is complete. Specifically, airfield suppression strikes against the Iranian bases where transferred aircraft are currently concentrated, executed before those aircraft are dispersed to hardened shelters and before the Iranian air defense network has fully incorporated their friendly identification signatures. After integration is complete, those strike options face a fundamentally different environment. 300 combat aircraft dispersed across hardened shelters at multiple Iranian air bases, protected by a fully integrated air defense network that includes the transferred aircraft's own self-defense capability, cannot be meaningfully suppressed by an Israeli strike force operating without American support and facing contested airspace that Su-35S integration creates. The window is real, it is closing, and the decision being made in that underground command facility in Tel Aviv tonight is the most consequential military decision in Israeli history since June 1967. Now, let me be honest about the operational constraints on the Israeli strike option, because no serious military analysis ignores constraints. Israeli strike aircraft operating against targets in western Iran. Shahid Noj outside Hamadan is approximately 400 kilometers from Israeli territory, require aerial refueling to complete the mission and return. Israel's tanker fleet is limited. Its capacity to refuel a strike package of the size required to meaningfully suppress 300 aircraft across multiple Iranian air bases is a genuine operational constraint, not a theoretical one. The American support that would normally supplement Israeli tanker capacity, the KC-135s and KC-46 that would extend Israeli strike range and enable a larger attack package, is subject to the same political and strategic constraints that have produced American operational hesitation throughout this conflict. The window is open. The question is whether Israel has the independent capability to exploit it, and whether it can accept the escalation consequences of doing so without the American backing that every previous Israeli strike of this magnitude has depended upon. What air superiority loss actually means mission by mission. I want to walk through the specific operational consequences of losing air superiority with the precision that 40 years of doctrine built on that superiority demands. Because the mainstream coverage has characterized this as a degradation of capability, I want to be unambiguous. It is not a degradation. It is a doctrinal invalidation. Strike operations. American and Israeli strike operations against Iranian military targets have been planned on the assumption that strike aircraft can reach their targets, conduct their attacks, and return without facing a capable opposing air force in the engagement corridor. Su-35S fighters contesting that corridor do not make strike operations impossible. They make them expensive. Expensive in escort fighter requirements that reduce the strike aircraft proportion of every package. Expensive in electronic warfare support requirements that consume specialized assets in limited supply, expensive in beyond visual range missile expenditure that depletes finite inventories whose replenishment is measured in weeks. Strike operations can be executed. They cannot be executed at the tempo and scale that current American and Israeli operational planning assumes. Reconnaissance. The American intelligence picture that has supported every military operation in this conflict, satellite and aerial reconnaissance providing targeting data, force tracking, and battle damage assessment, depends on aerial reconnaissance assets operating in airspace adjacent to the Iranian threat envelope. The MiG-31BM's 300-kilometer engagement envelope puts those assets at risk in airspace they have operated freely for decades. American reconnaissance operations will not cease. They will be pushed further from Iranian territory, reducing resolution, responsiveness, and coverage of the target sets that operational planning depends upon. The intelligence picture degrades. Every operation conducted on a degraded intelligence picture carries higher risk and lower effectiveness than doctrine assumes. Resupply and evacuation. The resupply operations for American forces in Iraq, the logistics lifeline for thousands of personnel whose bases were struck by precision missile attacks, depended on air corridors that American air superiority kept open. Those corridors now pass through airspace that Su-34 strike aircraft operating from Hamadan can contest. Resupply aircraft operating without fighter escort in contested airspace are vulnerable. Fighter escort for every resupply flight consumes combat aircraft availability needed simultaneously for every other mission. The sustainability of American forces already operating at the edge of their logistics margins has just become significantly more complex to maintain. Naval aviation. The carrier strike groups already repositioned beyond the DF-26 engagement envelope, already constrained in their ability to project power into the Gulf theater by the range limitations that repositioning imposed, now face an additional constraint from Su-34 strike aircraft whose combat radius reaches their current operating positions. American carriers that retreated from one threat must now assess whether their current positions remain safe from manned strike aircraft whose capabilities significantly exceed the drone and missile threats that repositioning was calculated to avoid. The operational space available to American naval power in this theater is contracting from multiple vectors simultaneously. Washington's response and what it tells us. Let me address the American response to this transfer with the directness the situation demands, because the question of why Washington did not act to prevent a transfer that American intelligence detected 72 hours before its completion is the question whose answer most clearly reveals the strategic constraints defining American behavior throughout this conflict. The transfer was detected. American satellites tracked the initial aircraft movements from Russian air bases within hours of their beginning. The ferry flight routes, the cargo aircraft carrying ground support equipment, the Russian technical personnel deploying to Hamadan, all of it visible to American intelligence, with sufficient lead time to have informed a diplomatic or military response before the transfer was complete. No response was executed. The reasons are the same structural constraints that have produced American hesitation at every previous decision point in this conflict, compounded by one specific additional factor this transfer creates. The aircraft being transferred are Russian military aircraft, operated by Russian Air Force pilots during the ferry flights, supported by Russian technical personnel on Iranian soil. Any American military action to interdict the transfer, strikes against ferry flight routes, strikes against Hamadan during the arrival window, diplomatic ultimatums backed by credible military threat, risks direct military engagement with Russian personnel. direct military engagement with Russian personnel in a maximum nuclear tension environment. The escalation pathway from American strikes on Russian aircraft to nuclear threshold management runs through a decision architecture that no American president in this strategic environment is positioned to navigate. The transfer was not stopped because stopping it required accepting a risk of direct American-Russian military engagement at the moment of maximum nuclear tension. That risk was not acceptable, and Iranian and Russian strategic planners understood that it would not be acceptable. The Russian air transfer was not primarily a Russian decision to enhance Iranian military capability. It was a Russian decision to transfer military assets in a manner that required American response to engage Russian personnel, knowing that the current strategic environment made that engagement politically and strategically impossible. The transfer is the action. American paralysis is the objective. The 300 aircraft on Iranian soil are simultaneously the military capability transferred and the proof of concept for a methodology of American constraint that will be replicated wherever Russian strategic interests require limiting American military options. The strategic implications beyond tonight. In Moscow, this transfer has produced the strategic outcome the entire sequence of Russian actions in this conflict has been designed to achieve, not Iranian military victory, American strategic paralysis. Every Russian action in this series has been calibrated to stay below the threshold of direct American-Russian military engagement while progressively degrading the American military capability that Israeli and Gulf security depends upon. The methodology is precise. Transfer weapons that American response would require engaging Russian personnel to prevent, execute in an environment where engaging Russian personnel risks nuclear escalation, watch American capability degrade without American response, collect the strategic benefit of a Middle East where Russian-supplied air power contests American air superiority without Russia firing a single shot in anger. In Beijing, this methodology is being studied as a template for Pacific application. The specific combination of Russian personnel involvement, nuclear escalation environment, and compressed transfer timeline that made American response impossible tonight is a template whose Pacific variant is immediately visible to Chinese strategic planners. The methodology does not require Chinese military action. It requires Chinese willingness to accept the escalation risk that American response would create, and a calculation that American paralysis in the face of that risk is the more likely outcome. Tonight's events have provided the empirical validation of that calculation. In Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, the air balance shift is being assessed against the specific vulnerability of Gulf state military infrastructure to an Iranian air capability that now includes Su-34 strike aircraft within combat radius of every Gulf capital. The American security partnerships that have provided the political framework for Gulf defense investments are operating in an environment of demonstrated American paralysis. The security conversations with Beijing that Gulf states have been quietly initiating are now urgent.